What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school and pretty much, there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures even after it was obvious it hit the fan. They didn't die accepting their fate, they died astronauts. That's something to be admired in my opinion. The same happened with Columbia. The crew were working the systems to try to troubleshoot and recover even as the space shuttle was burning up and breaking apart around them. The crew cabin was the last piece to break apart. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the US Air Force in the 1950s alone. Boeing X-37B unmanned space shuttle. It just spent 720 days in space doing God knows what. Testing stuff. And maybe taking pictures like the one Trump tweeted of the Iranian space launch site. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same on ecological protesters from organizations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago. An undercover cop, I believe, married and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. And then he didn't have to pay child support cause he was on the job, and our government said they weren't liable either. Freaking joke. Suspiciously, she always has a headache when I propose having X. Possible capitalist plot. She's always volunteering to take the children to school on Mondays. Possibility of capitalist indoctrination of our children? Must interrogate them later. Operation Northwoods. A plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. My high school English teacher mandated that I read this. I didn't understand it at the time, but he was responding to my question I posed him. As an airborne vet, why do you seem so jaded in regards to US history and politics? Still one of my favorite teachers to this day. He and I were able to go into a lot other Ost things the US has done. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. $20 million to be precise. I don't know. The way my friend's cat is staring at me right now. Maybe they succeeded. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Is anyone else ridiculously disturbed that they named that Project Sunshine? What the frick? The German radar guidance system Wotan was a great example on why your project, operation named should have nothing to do with their content. Explain like I'm 5? During World War II, the British gained some intelligence referring to a new radar system called Gerald, also known as Wotan. Wotan being a single-eyed mythical god, engineers were able to figure out what the system was and how it worked based on it using a single beam, one eye. Good thing the USA didn't call it Project Dead Kid Limb then, eh? Can't remember the source, but apparently there is a legit order signed by Hitler to his nuclear researchers saying if they have a viable nuclear explosive, start loading into V2s immediately. However, Germans didn't come that close to making a nuclear bomb. They didn't consider it a priority. because they calculated that it wouldn't be a decisive weapon to win the war, especially against US who would already have nuclear bombs in their arsenal. Estimates put the probable year for a German nuke, if the efforts continued, around 1947. Fun fact: the Nuclear Research Institute in Berlin was one of the main objectives of the Red Army during the Battle of Berlin. Stalin really wanted to get there before the Americans. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. Not military, but psychology. Similar story. Some psychologists wanted to see the impact of mothers and socialization during early childhood. So he took newborn monkeys and put them in sensory deprivation pits where they never had any contact with anything. They spent months there becoming unresponsive and huddling in a corner. They went insane and grew up totally messed up. When introduced to regular monkeys they would freak out, and when females were inseminated and gave birth they would casually eat fingers of their babies or smash them around or dismember them. Google Pit of Despair experiment. Google Pit of Despair experiment. Nope. New Zealand's UFO files are a bit creepy. I was in the library and stumbled across the bound files. There's a lot of assumed crazy people being crazy. But there's also one specific one that stood out from respectable Air Force pilots who were both in the air, conducted mini tests, for example blinking, moving the plane in relation to the object, verifying what he saw with the co-pilot to ensure it wasn't an illusion or his mind. I don't know, just the fact that you'd assume he wasn't crazy creeps me out so much. Not declassified, but leaked. Operation Yellowhammer. The government tried to say it was old, but it had an August date on it. And now you said it here. They're coming for you. Run. Dude. Mew English is nowhere good enough to comprehend the wiki article. Could you please summarize? It's the UK government's plan for the eventuality of a no-deal Brexit. Basically life in the UK would be turned upside down for a few months. Food and medical shortages are expected. The royal family might be evacuated to a safe place. Police will have too much on their hands to investigate crime, etc. Dogs and cats living together. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession. A couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. Dahmer should have been prosecuted for what he did in the army. For capture began the day he and Dahmer, an army medic, were put into a room together. The assaults began at once and, eventually, he leapt from the 3rd floor window to escape. I had probably been raped 8 to 10 times, I don't know. He was tying me to the bunk with motor pool rope. He took all my clothing from me. He would either beat me before he raped me or he would beat me after. I had no idea that he did while in the army. The most horrifying thing is that he was never punished for it and that this monster ruined so many people. Brfore, he started his rampage of destroying men. What a horrible human. Another fricked up Dahmer fact is that he had a victim get away. A young, teenage male. The boy made it to cops, bloody and bruised. Dahmer caught up, told the cops it was just a lover's spat, and the cops sent the kid back with Dahmer. Dahmer killed him. Bloody and bruised doesn't begin to describe it. The guy had a hole drilled in his head with acid poured in it by that point. He also was Vietnamese and didn't speak much English, which contributed to the police not helping. One US bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major US city, can't remember which, but luckily it didn't detonate. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, and set up the country for the icha that is Guatemala today. Just like Nicaragua, Guatemala is a beautiful country and the people are also beautiful. But, as one taxi driver said to me, 25 families own everything in the country. Corruption is rife and the destabilization caused by the involvement of the US has been devastating for the country and its people. I watched from my hotel balcony as people came to the lake to bathe and wash their clothes. Hoopsie daisy. MKUltra. Partially illegal, forced mind control experiments utilizing psychoactive drugs, conducted by the CIA in 1950s, 60s. More specifically, the death of Frank Olson. Olson was going to expose Project MKUltra. Olson was a CIA employee who was dosed with LSD by his supervisor and then committed suicide 9 days later by jumping out of his hotel window. After an autopsy, there was some evidence found that he was unconscious when he plunged out of the window. I got lost in a googling wormhole one night on the MKUltra stuff and Jesus Christ, it was terrifying.